After 20 plus years with the Canadian Auto Workers Union and Unifor, economist Jim Stanford pulled up stakes and moved to Australia. He's back in the Great White North for a quick visit, and we thought we'd ask him 10 questions on life for a Canadian down under. Welcome, can I say home?
Oh, for sure.
It's still home.
Good eye, Steve. It's great to be back.
You're picking up. If you start asking me about shrimps on the bobby, we're going to have a big problem
there
here.
we go.
Let's do our 10 questions here, starting with number one. What was the most unanticipated thing about Australia you did not expect to encounter?
Well, the big shocker, I'd say so far, was when I got off the plane and then tried to put a roof over my head. The price of housing down there is incredible. We're in Sydney, which is the most expensive city. Housing there is probably close to twice as expensive as Toronto, which is expensive to start with. But even outside of Sydney, the price of housing is unbelievable.
The average house here is $1 million. It's more than that there?
Average house there for an equivalent would be $2 million in Sydney. So, and the dollar is about 1 to 1. So you're talking the same money.
Question two, what are the most significant differences in their political system from ours that you've noticed already?
Well, a lot of it's similar, of course. You know, the 24-hour news cycle, the hyper-partisanship, the policy discussions that get lost most of the time, unfortunately. Some of the differences, they have a federal election every 3 years, so you really feel like you're in an endless campaign. They got some differences in their voting system. The Senate is elected, but according to proportional representation. And then even in their, what the equivalent of our House of Commons, their voting is with a ranked ballot. So you can pick your first choice, second choice, third choice. So you get some interesting dynamics. Another difference, they can kick out their prime minister on a day's notice by a vote of his or her caucus. So,
and they have.
And they have, exactly. So it's even more sort of fluid and rapidly evolving than ours. Perhaps I'd say even a bit more shallow and driven by the optics of it all, unfortunately.
And their Liberal Party is not really liberal.
Oh God, no. No, their Liberals are in a kind of a coalition with a sort of a rural conservative party called the National Party, and that's the right wing of politics. They are heading into an election this summer, it looks like.
Question three, what are the most significant differences in their middle class that you've seen so far?
A lot of similarities in the dream, of course, of the middle class, everyone having their own half acre and their house and their car and hoping for the best for their kids. If anything, in Australia, they've kind of spread out more geographically as far as middle class neighborhoods and that kind of thing, perhaps because they've got a lot of terrain, you know, like Canada, but their cities are even less dense than Canada. So you have these neighborhoods that go on and on and on with middle class houses. On the other hand, the middle class there is feeling very, very insecure, just like here. You know, the elimination of good jobs, the cost of housing, of course, is going to give lots of people nightmares. You know, concern for the future of their children, if their children are actually going to be able to inherit that same standard of living.
Question four, most significant differences and or similarities in their employment situation.
Traditionally in Australia, and of course being a labor economist, I'm very interested in this, they tended to have a culture that I think sort of respected the working class, you know, and the role of the working man or the working woman, even in their history. Like their equivalent of our Upper Canada Rebellion, that would be an event that sparked them on the course to independence, was a strike in a gold mine. It was called the Eureka Rebellion, and it plays exactly the same role in their sort of national narrative, but it's a story about, you know, working people fighting for some justice, and there's a culture about a fair go for all is what they call it. And they still have some rules and structures, I think, to support the chance for the average working person, for the battler, as they call it, to get a decent share of the wealth. So their minimum wage, for example, is $16 an hour. Higher minimum wages set in different sectors of the economy, like in hospitality and restaurants. They have something called the Fair Work Commission, which even if you're not in a union, can come in and give an arbitration award saying, no, you were mistreated by your employer and you're supposed to get this back. So there's a tradition there, but I would say it is under threat, again, from some of the same pressures we face here around precarious work, loss of good jobs in industry and so on.
Our attempted revolution by the reformers against the Family Compact, which happened about 6 blocks north of here
yes.
in 1837, failed. Did theirs succeed or fail?
It's similar. The immediate strike failed and was crushed, and in fact the leaders of the strike were tried for murder because there was a battle and a couple of soldiers died. The leader of the strike was eventually acquitted, so he was not hung. But again, it's the same thing where the immediate battle was lost, but then it took on a greater importance, and it's still seen as a symbol of Australians' desire for independence.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Question 5, the most significant differences and or similarities in their pension plans compared to ours.
Okay, this is really interesting terrain. They do have a compulsory universal pension system where every employer, even a small business, has to pay in a significant amount, usually about 10% of the workers' wages, into a personal pension plan. They call it superannuation. So the closest equivalent would be like our RRSP system here in Canada. Every employer has to pay in, and then you take your fund with you if you change jobs during the course of your career, as most people do now. So the universality of it is a good thing. The negative aspect is, of course, just like our RRSPs, you're playing the markets. So there's the brokers who take their 2 or 3%. You don't know what your pension is going to be worth depending on the ups or downs of the market. So, some things positive, some things negative about the system.
Any idea whether, we have a CPP Canada pension plan, we have an Ontario plan that is in the the early stages of happening. Do they also have federal and state pensions there?
No, they don't even have the equivalent of a CPP. They have what's called an age pension, which would be closest equivalent to our GIS, our Guaranteed Income Supplement. That's a kind of a means-tested thing for people who are poor. So that's kind of the bare bones. They don't have a CPP, which offers a kind of a guaranteed pension to everyone who worked, and I think that's what they need.
Question 6, the most significant differences and or similarities between our education systems.
Again, some positives, some negatives. In the lower education for primary and secondary, they have a really strong private school system that I find quite worrisome. My kid's going to a public school there, and it's quite good, very comparable, I'd say, in quality and standards to what she did here. But about 1 in 3 kids in Australia goes to a private school. Ironically, the government subsidizes the private schools, yet then they charge tuition on top of the subsidy. So it does become a 2-tier education system. And that gets a momentum of its own going, because more and more middle-class people say, my kid won't stand a chance unless I go to the private system, unless I send them to the private system. I think it's very dangerous, and we could learn from that in terms of what to avoid here.
We ask education, of course. We ask healthcare.
Healthcare.
Question 7, similarities, differences in the healthcare system.
They have a Medicare system in many ways similar to ours. I've already got my Medicare card, which is a good thing, Steve, because they drive on the wrong side of the road down there, and I'm always worried I'm going to step off the curb without looking the right way. So I'm covered by Medicare. It's good. They have pharmacare as part of the deal, so prescription drugs are covered under the system, which makes a lot of sense.
The National Pharmacare Program.
Yes, exactly.
That everybody's in on.
Yeah, you pay $2 or $3 or $5 for a prescription, a little copay, but the overall cost is covered, and that makes sense because you think about it, 30–40% of healthcare costs now are all the drugs. The negative aspect is they allow extra billing by doctors, so they can charge you personally on top of what the Medicare covers.
Which we banned here 30 years ago.
Exactly, and we banned it because we knew it would create a 2-tier system, and that's exactly what you see down there. There's one class of healthcare for people who are willing to pay that extra or who have a private insurance scheme, a different class for everyone else. Kind of a similar dynamic as we saw with the schools.
Question 8, maybe it's too early to tell, but how about the role of women in society? Have you been able to come to any conclusions about that yet?
Yeah, well, we've watched this because I happen to live with 3 feminists down there, so we're having these conversations
4
all
if you
the
include
time.
Yourself,
okay, fair enough. Good point. Yeah, our prime minister is a feminist, so I can be too.
Yep.
We're always comparing it, and again, there's pluses and minuses. I would say, on the whole, the kind of redneck, macho, outback, rugged culture in Australia has carried forward more than in Canada. So that you do see in, say, advertising or the way people dress, the gender roles in society and in jobs. Probably more barriers for women, and even in economics you see it. Women's labor force participation is significantally lower than it would be in Canada. On the other hand, women aren't putting up with that. They're demanding different attitudes and changes. So, and it's not like Canada's perfect in that regard.
Question 9. We are proud of our beer, our Canadian-made beer, and of course the LCBO remits more than, well, I think it's almost $2 billion a year to the Ontario Treasury every year. What's the situation in the story on alcohol down there?
Well, they have beer, but it's nothing to write home about. Their wine is what you really notice. They've got some beautiful wines, of course. The liquor distribution system is all privatized, so they don't get that piece of the revenue. You know, and again, there's arguments whether that's good or bad. I think it means you tend to get a lower quality, kind of dispersed, disaggregated liquor system. You actually have less choice in some of those stores. On the other hand, the Australian wines are lovely. I think they do have a problem with alcohol consumption. They are one of the heaviest drinking countries in the world, and among young adults in particular, there's a clear problem of binge drinking and alcohol abuse. You know, it seems to be sort of a rite of passage or something, but it's not a very healthy one. So.
Question 10. I noticed the other day there was a survey that came out that said Canada is the 6th happiest country in the world. And I wonder what the general attitude to life is down under.
I don't know where Australia ranked on that. That would be an interesting question. I think, you know, again, there's a stereotype of Australians being, you know, no worries, mate, easygoing, cut out of work early to go surfing, you know, which has its appeal. The whole population pretty well lives very close to the ocean. And there's a grain of truth to it. You know, people are, I think, less pressured. Very rare to see men wearing a tie, even at work, you know. Not in such a rush to get things done. So perhaps that translates into a happier quality of life. Give me a bit more time to see if it actually comes through in reality.
You're on. We'll have you back. We'll have you back next time you visit us here in the Great White North.
Thank you very much, Steve.
10 questions for Jim Stanford.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.